Our story begins on Kamino a few days after the incidents with Clone Trooper 5's. Prime Minister Lama Su was gathering a secret Kaminoan council to discuss their future with Dark Tyrannus and his master. The near exposure of Order 66 to the Jedi most certainly has shaken the trust that these Sith have with the Kaminoans, and so Lama Su was deciding that perhaps it's best they get out ahead of the treachery of the Sith. At the heart of everything, the Kaminoans cared about one thing above all: profit. Tyrannus had paid a hefty sum to ensure that the inhibitor chips were inserted into the clone troopers' minds, and when the time comes, the clones will most certainly turn on the Jedi. But as the Kaminoan Council gathered, they finally asked the question no one had yet considered: what will happen after the Jedi are wiped out and the war comes to an end? Who's to say that these Sith will not simply come to Kamino and enact another genocide on them? The Kaminoans began to realize that the Sith cannot be trusted, and if they want to survive and continue to profit for years to come, then perhaps their path should be altered. The group asked Lama Su what he was considering, and so the Prime Minister laid out his plan. It has become abundantly clear that the Jedi care about the clones. If the war ends and the Jedi win, then the Jedi will make sure that Kamino is safe and the clones are kept around. If the Sith win, they will have no issue betraying Kamino and either taking over the cloning themselves or finding a cheaper alternative. So Lama Su proposed something that only the few Kaminoans in Council today will know about. The inhibitor chips must be remotely shut down. They will betray the Sith first. So, for months, Nala Se would get to work to do this and find the perfect solution. During the war, she developed what would be called the Whisper Protocol, a high-frequency resonance that would operate just above the threshold of human hearing, but deep within the sensory range of the Kaminoan engineered clone brain. It was subtle and silent, like a ghost humming through the walls. She embedded the frequency in the city's ventilation hum, the medical ward tones, even the faint static of the training room speakers. The clones barely noticed. Some would report a soft ringing in their skulls, an odd pressure behind the eyes, but it would be dismissed as fatigue or stress. What they didn't know was the sound was unraveling their inhibitor chips thread by thread. The signal was a slow corrosion. With just minutes of hearing this tone, neural control pathways would break down gently and without trauma. All clone troopers in the Grand Army would occasionally return to Kamino around once a month for routine checkups or just a night away from the fighting, and they would all hear the signal. For the few that were stationed away from Kamino at all times, they would receive a message from Nala Se instructing them to report any unusual sleep patterns, and in the message, the soft frequency would play to them, unraveling their chip. It worked perfectly, as the Kaminoans were able to disrupt their own secret weapon. By the time the final months of the war had arrived, all of the clones who cycled through Kamino no longer had functioning chips, and no one even noticed. Order 66 would be coming, and Nala Se had already been the one to destroy it. The Kaminoan Council was pleased, not just because they were choosing sides in the war, but because when this war ends, the Jedi are simply more likely to help them continue making money. The treachery of the Sith would soon be used against them. And now, we flash forward many months later, as the sun has set on Coruscant and the blue hue of night is covering the city planet. The city, per usual, is still full of constant waves of traffic, but tonight something was different. Over 100 Republic clone gunships were flying towards the Jedi Temple, as Supreme Chancellor Palpatine has just issued an order to every single clone trooper in the Grand Army: execute Order 66. Somehow, every clone knew exactly what this meant. The Jedi have committed treason, and they are to be executed immediately. But these clones were people. They were not emotionless droids, created to follow every order without question. At least, not anymore. Thanks to the Kaminoans, the clones were free to make their own choices. And as the gunships flew towards the Jedi Temple, none of the clones spoke. They all knew this was wrong, but at the front of the gunships was General Anakin Skywalker. Could this really all be so wrong, if the hero of the war was at the front of all of it? But across the galaxy, clones were receiving these new orders, and they were making their choice. On Megiddo, snow and ash fell through the war-torn streets, as Commander Bakara stood just behind Mundi, and the Jedi Master was running ahead into another push against the Separatists. Then it came in. Order 66. Execute the Jedi. Bakara's breath was caught. He and his men knew it would be treason to disobey this order, but still, something felt so wrong. It was so sudden. He remembered Mundi sitting behind a wounded clone for hours, waiting for him to wake. He remembered the time the Jedi had stepped between Bakara and a collapsing structure, saving his life. He remembered the kindness, but also the ruthlessness, by Mundi in battle. Bakara's finger hovered near his blaster trigger, and Mundi turned around in confusion. And then, these clones decided not to fire. They first must figure out what is truly going on. On Felucia, Commander Bly walked at Ayla Secura's side. She was in the lead, as always, unaware of the message that had just come through the clone comms: Order 66. For a moment, everything blurred. Images of her defending the clones with her blue blade and her open heart, training with them, joking with them, bleeding beside them in the terrible jungle. He looked at Ayla, then down at the blaster in his hand. The men beside him had received the same order. One clone raised his rifle, confused and unsure, and Bly stepped in front of Ayla, holding up his hand, commanding the clone to lower it. The clone hesitated, as Bly said that's an order. Ayla looked between them, concern spreading across her face. She sensed something in the Force, in the men, and then Bly turned to her, revealing that the clones have been ordered to execute the Jedi. Her saber snapped into her hand, but she didn't ignite it. She didn't need to. The clones were forming a circle around her to make it known they will not fight her. Out on Cato Nemoidia, Plo Koon's Jedi starfighter sliced between the bridges. Commander Wolffe sat in one of the starfighters above, watching the Jedi soar through the sky. The order came in with Palpatine flashing on the screen. Captain Jag caught his breath, hands twitching at the guns in his own ship. Plo had flown with them countless times. He'd pulled clones from wreckage, remembered their names, treated them like equals. The command said that he was a traitor, though. Jag looked to Wolffe, awaited the order, but Wolffe didn't speak. Plo had once stood in a downed crater with Wolffe, defending injured troopers for hours. That's all he could remember in this moment. Wolffe looked down at the Jedi fighter, and he pressed the comms, telling the Jedi General that Supreme Chancellor Palpatine has ordered the execution of all Jedi, including him. Plo didn't speak for a long time. Then, through the comms, he told the clones to do what they must to avoid treason, and he took off flying through the city. Jag looked to Wolffe, as Wolffe just shook his head and smiled, saying they'll never catch him, and that's a good thing. On Kashyyyk, Commander Gree looked at Yoda. Gree had admired the old master more than any other Jedi he'd known. His hands trembled as the clone beside him reached for his weapon. Gree stopped him with a single motion. Yoda turned, sensing something, and he gave a small nod of shared understanding as he asked if this was Palpatine's doing. Gree just nodded, and Yoda said that Gree must report him in as dead. In fact, Yoda told Gree to reach out to as many commanders as possible, have them do the same. Yoda suspected that the relationships between the Jedi and the clones would override the orders from Palpatine for at least most of them. Have the clones report their Jedi as dead, and let Palpatine believe he is winning. On Utapau, the blast would never come. Commander Cody immediately ordered his men not to fire, calling Obi-Wan back to him, telling him everything. Obi-Wan immediately thought of Anakin, and he knew deep down something must have gone terribly wrong. And on Coruscant, Anakin Skywalker stood at the Jedi Temple stairs as the Republic gunships descended, kicking up dust and loose stone as they landed behind him. Their doors were hissing open one by one, and the blue marked soldiers of the 501st marched down, blasters gripped tight, eyes focused, hearts telling them not to do this. At the front, General Skywalker ordered the clones to follow him. They have their orders. Every single Jedi is now a threat to the galaxy, and they must be defeated. The march up the steps began, but as they reached the midway point, something shifted. The first line of troopers behind Anakin halted. Anakin slowly turned, his emotions of anger and hatred boiling up as the clones didn't raise their blasters at the temple. They raised the blasters at him. Anakin's eyes met the barrels of over a dozen rifles. Oppo stood at the front of the group, visor locked onto the man that he'd followed for years, a man he no longer recognized. His fingers didn't tremble, but his voice nearly cracked when he spoke, genuinely asking Skywalker what is going on here, nearly begging Anakin to stand down. Anakin didn't answer. He looked away from Oppo and the temple doors. He could feel the Jedi behind the doors. He could see the path before him, almost as if it had already happened. Slaughter, power, salvation for him. It had to be done. He had no choice. Anakin muttered that the Jedi have betrayed the Republic. They tried to kill the Chancellor, but Oppo didn't lower his rifle, and neither did the men behind him. In the silence that followed, 1,000 memories would turn in the hearts of these troopers, fighting beside Anakin, who treated them like brothers, watching Jedi generals throw themselves between blaster fire and their men, laughing, bleeding, surviving with them. And then they thought of the younglings. Were they supposed to enter the temple and raise their weapons against these children? Commander Oppo's stomach twisted. He remembered Ahsoka Tano kneeling beside a clone who'd lost his leg, refusing to leave him behind. He remembered Anakin Skywalker cracking a joke in battle, lifting morale like no one else. Always he'd been able to do that, but this man wasn't their general anymore. Anakin's hand was hovering near his saber. Something inside him was terribly wrong. Oppo told Anakin to snap out of it. This isn't him. Another clone told Anakin he's not the man they followed into battle. Anakin didn't know what to say. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. He wasn't the traitor. He was supposed to be saving everything. Padme, the child, the Republic. He clenched his fists, the weight of destiny coiling around him. The temple loomed behind him, the future promise within its walls. All he had to do in order to achieve the power to save Padme was go into the temple, destroy the Jedi, find his true power. But Anakin now saw just how alone he truly was. He could hear voices in his mind of Palpatine's promises. He could see Padme's smile. He could feel Windu's screams, and all of it crashed together in a deafening storm inside of his mind. He saw now that even if Padme survived, she would never look at him the same. She would never stand for what he has become. He grabbed his lightsaber, dropping it to the stairs with a soft clatter. His eyes lifted to the sky, as though hoping for some kind of answer, some kind of undoing for all of this. But there was no answer for him in the stars. The second the saber fell out of his hand, the clones moved. Stun bolts were bursting forward, and Anakin's body convulsed, collapsed, and crumpled beside the very weapon his master once told him was his life. The clones were surrounding him, lowering their weapons with quiet certainty, and above the temple, the gunships were now hovering silently. Appo raised a hand, and across the city, the 501st would stand down. The temple remained untouched, and the Jedi inside would soon come into contact with Appo and his closest advisors, as they would speak to Shaak Ti and Sindralic about the attack that was stopped on the stairs. Anakin would be put inside of a Jedi temple cell. Across the city, Darth Sidious watched the reports come in across the galaxy. Kashyyyk, Megiddo, Felucia, Utapau, many more. The commanders were reporting the deaths of their Jedi generals, and Sidious was extremely pleased. And yet, the feeling in the Force was not changing. Sure, he could feel some death, as clones killed the Jedi, but for all the reports coming in, the wave of darkness should have been so much worse. And he moved close to an office window, looking out to the Jedi Temple. Nothing had shifted or changed. Sidious felt something rising up in himself, something he thought he'd mastered: fear. He quickly moved over to the communications console, punching in the code for Kamino. When there was no answer, Sidious began to wonder if it was him that was betrayed after all. Meanwhile, in space above Coruscant, Republic Venators slowly began emerging above the planet, with their Jedi generals in the lead. Plo Koon, Yoda, Obi-Wan and Ki-Adi-Mundi were the first Jedi to arrive back to Coruscant with their men, and Yoda quickly gave the order: get into LAAT gunships, prepare to surround the executive building. Sidious cannot be allowed to escape. So, gunships began pouring out of these Venators, with all four of the Jedi leading the way. Obi-Wan next to Cody, Yoda with Gree, Plo with Wolf, and Mundi with Bakara. As the gunships descended into Coruscant, more of them began rising up from the Jedi Temple, joining the surrounding group around the executive building. And in his gunship, Ki-Adi-Mundi began walking through the small ship, looking to each of his men. He was giving a speech about how this is the most important fight they will ever be a part of. Together, they will win. But suddenly, a strong burst of lightning slammed into the engine, and this gunship exploded. Mundi, Bakara, and the squad in here were gone in a second, and the rest of the gunships were forced to veer off. Sidious was now standing in his window, second lightsaber ignited, blasting lightning up at the ships. Coruscant's sky had quickly become a war zone, as Republic LAAT gunships were swarming the Senate district like Geonosian bugs, converging on a nest. Civilian speeders were scattering away as quickly as they could as Sidious stood, hands outstretched, unleashing violent arcs of blue lightning across the sky, striking gunships mid-flight. One LAT spiraled into a corkscrew descent of fire and debris, the explosion colliding with the building below. The remaining gunships veered away, dipping through the growing storm of smoke and flame, twisting through the capital's skyline in erratic patterns to avoid the Sith Lord's cackling wrath. Turbo lasers lit up the sky, firing at Palpatine, but nothing seemed to breach the shielding that surrounded Sidious as he used the Force to keep himself safe. One LAT took a bolt to its undercarriage, splitting open, sending flaming bodies hurling toward the surface. And yet from within the formation, three shapes were flying through the air, blades igniting mid-air. Yoda leapt first, spinning through the lightning, his green saber a blur, as he deflected a blast mid-jump. Plo Koon followed close behind, flipping from one transport to the next, dodging spiraling debris. Obi-Wan was bouncing off the wing of a falling gunship, hurling himself higher with each bound. The three Jedi moved together through the chaos, using the very destruction Sidious was creating as fuel for their approach. As the lightning struck again, Yoda caught it on his blade, grounding it through a shattering chunk of the executive building as he spun upward toward the shattered window. In the final instant, Sidious's eyes flashed just as the Jedi flew at him, and Yoda's kick connected squarely with his chest. The impact sent Sidious crashing across the office, robes flaring behind him, until he slammed into the edge of his desk with a bone-rattling crunch. The gunships outside once more surrounded the building, and on the ground, the 501st troopers were able to convince Fox and the Coruscant Guard to stand down as they began to enter the building. To the citizens of the galaxy, it looked right now as if the Grand Army were turning against the Republic, when in fact, they were the ones trying to save it. In his office, Sidious rose from the shattered desk with a snarl, eyes burning gold, as he ignited his lightsaber, and the Jedi moved in. Yoda landed low, sweeping his saber toward Sidious's ankles. Sidious jumped, twisting, redirecting the attack into a sharp downward jab at the Grandmaster. Obi-Wan intercepted this strike mid-swing, their sabers locking with a hiss. Sparks erupted between them as Plo Koon came from behind, attempting to drive his blade into the opening of Sidious's back. The Sith Lord kicked back with a jarring snap, catching Plo in the chest and sending him skidding across the floor into a shattered statue. Before Obi-Wan could adjust, Sidious slammed his elbow into the Jedi's jaw, jaw, blasting him with a point-blank burst of lightning. Kenobi flew across the office, hitting the far wall. Yoda came in again, faster this time, saber swinging low then high, then low once more in a tight, relentless sequence as he flipped around. Sidious matched every hit, parrying with swift efficiency. He shifted his stance, launching a flurry of vertical strikes, pushing Yoda backwards, saber pressing harder with each swing. Poe recovered and rushed in from the right, his strikes more aggressive, feinting once and driving hard towards Sidious's ribs. The Sith spun in response, catching both sabers into a cross block. Then he shoved outward with a force pulse that cracked the other statues still intact. Obi-Wan rejoined the fight from behind, blade connecting with Sidious's just before it struck Plo. The three Jedi now fought in rhythm, alternating their attacks, forcing Sidious to rotate constantly. Every time he raised his blade, another came from the opposite side. Sidious growled, retreating a step towards the center of the room, breathing harder now, his blade moving in tighter and tighter arcs, and Sidious launched himself backward with a burst of the Force, slamming into the far wall as his chest heaved, eyes wide with fury. Before he could recover, Yoda was already airborne, spinning into another downward strike that Sidious barely caught. Their blades clashed again, but this time Yoda didn't hold. He dropped low, spun, and knocked Sidious off balance with a sweep of the leg. As the Sith fell, Plo charged in, driving his saber downward. Sidious raised his hand, but Obi-Wan was faster. He surged in and severed Sidious's wrist. Sidious tried to rise back up, only for Yoda to leap onto the desk, then drive his blade through the Sith's chest, pinning him there. His eyes flickered, rage still burning as he took his last, final breath. The room was silent now, as the LAAT lights shined inside, revealing the Jedi were victorious. Anakin Skywalker would not be forgiven quickly. The truth of his actions, the assault on Windu, the near attack on the temple, blind loyalty to a Sith, could not simply be ignored, but neither could the choice he made to stand down, nor the years of manipulation that had poisoned his mind. He would be held in the temple for a long while, watched closely, and it was Padme who would change the tide. When she gave birth to their twins in a safe hospital, Anakin was able to be there. He was a man rebuilding his life, with his family, one day at a time, though it would never be the same. The Jedi did not survive unscathed. The temple had been spared from destruction, but many clones had chosen to follow Order 66. They were not punished for it, they were simply following orders. Obi-Wan and Plo Koon would help to restructure the Order. Ahsoka would return with Maul in custody, and rejoin the Order in time, as they were becoming Guardians once more. The Republic also transformed. With the death of Sidious, the Senate launched sweeping reforms. Emergency powers were quickly revoked. Thousands of systems began the slow process of reconstruction, and the war was officially ended. Clones were granted citizenship, pensions, homes. Some would stay in service, protecting the vulnerable. Others disappeared into quiet lives. The cloning program on Kamino was shut down, but not destroyed as it would have been with the Empire. The Kaminoans were free to continue working however they pleased, and years later, Luke and Leia Skywalker would walk the halls of the Jedi Temple. Anakin had watched them grow with quiet joy. He never thought a true Jedi title like Master again, as his legacy was the choice he made on the steps of the temple, the day he refused to fall. And because of that choice, because of the help of the clones, the galaxy had endured. And folks, that is our story for today. Hope you enjoyed this one. I feel like I've got bad allergies because I was like short of breath the whole time. Had to take a break. Hey, who cares? Anyways, hope you guys enjoyed this one. Order 66 stories are some of the most fun to write, and I really wanted to focus planet to planet, jumping from Felucia, Megiddo, Kiddo Nemoidia, all the Jedi that we see in Revenge of the Sith, and just kind of take time to, instead of like, you know, just being like, and the clones didn't follow Order 66, to just kind of showing exactly what may have gone through their minds in the moment. I know I've maybe a little weird to have Mundi survive. I think Bakara would follow the Order mostly, but switched it up for this one because usually he does. And then I wanted to have a little fun little scene where the gunship just explodes as Mundi's giving a fun speech. So that was fun. Appreciate you guys listening. Let me know what you thought. Give me ideas in the comments. I'm always reading them. Sometimes I forget to actually reply and stuff, but I'm always there. So appreciate you guys. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video. Bye.